more specifically, so you just see it in the background. You can also see that the African galleries at the Met have not changed very much since then, but Dimba is on a tall pedestal in that gallery, in that glass case that we now call the aquarium, and that we are very much looking forward to not have anymore at some point. So this is how it's shown now, surrounded by other Baga works. It still really hasn't changed that much, which was really quite a realization for me going through these different archives, despite the fact that things are much more bundled together, crammed together in that space. And you can see how what the contrast is between the Banda mask, which still has that outfit, which was created for it in 1995 by our conservator, Christine Gentini, working from Fred's photograph and footage, and Dimba that is still undressed. So the question is, how do we really want to display these works now? We are in a moment where we're thinking about a full reinstallation of our African galleries. And one thing that we know is that we definitely would want to get it out of a case, out of the aquarium, hopefully in the open air. It will depend on a number of things. The issue for us on having works without plexi is that we have so much passage, foot traffic in the galleries, that it creates a lot of dust and a lot of conservation issues for these works. So we have a lot of things to take in consideration. However, I'm at a moment where, I think museum setting is just not a neutral setting, and it's already an artificial place, and that's just what it is. And I think a place like the Met is carrying a very specific history. It inscribes itself, within the history of the Museum of Primitive Art. And of course, we need to be able to change and adapt also to new scholarship. But at the same time, this is very much a fine arts institution that the origin of which is based on that history of creating a canon for the arts of Africa. So, I think we're really pondering these different ideas and thinking about what is the most relevant for an institution like ours in terms of displaying that type of works. And then why dress Dimba and not the other works in the collection? And then, if you enter there, then you end up with a museum that looks more like an anthropological museum, and this is also not what we're doing. So these are all questions that are being raised right now and that we're thinking about very carefully. So here it is. There was a very clear way of looking at Dimba that was created during the first 3 decades of the 20th century that continues to be reflected until today, and I think it's an interesting thing to look at. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you, Amanda, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really glad I got to see the Dimba before my talk. I'd not been here. I don't think I've ever been here, but maybe 20 years ago I was here, but things have obviously changed a lot. The disadvantage of going last is my colleagues have said some of the stuff I was going to say and shown some of the images I was going to show you. The advantage is I probably had too many images and too much to say, so I can gloss over things that have already been said. So I will just mention them and speed by. I'm still teaching this semester, so I think I'm still in didactic teaching mode, so I will have bullet points in my PowerPoint. And I thought, what Amanda asked me to talk about was the history of exhibiting Dimba. And I'm going to sort of touch on that, but also talk about exhibiting African objects in a more general sense. And I've called the topic for the 4 points, modes of representation and their presences and absences, because I think in every museum installation, no matter what kind of museum we're dealing with, there is the presence of the object, but that presence also signifies absences of things that are not there, intangible things, costumes, other dance performance, as well as information that's just sometimes either lacking or purposely omitted. I want to focus on 4 types of representations. And the first is the colonial mode of representation. This is sort of typical of the colonial period, the Belgian Congo Room at the Colonial Exposition in Brussels. And I think these kind of installations were focused on a lot of presence. There were a lot of objects that were stacked one on top of the other. Objects, some of which were made by Europeans, like brass sculptures, and then some African artifacts. I think they testify to colonial power through their quantity and through their almost over-determination of the objects that signify that people have been conquered in order for these objects to be here now in Europe. And if we switch to an early colonial representation showing the Dimba, I think the same can be said. This is about quantity. This is about showing trophies of conquest. And what's absent from this installation is any narrative of indigenous context, for sure, but also any narrative on the potential violence that was associated with the collection itself. So there's nothing really telling us exactly how these objects got here, and some of the images that Fred showed us, which of course are later than these objects, with Helen Lelou filling up her Jeep with those objects as she's driving around the country. This image actually shows not one but three Dimba, and they are all wearing the raffia skirt incorrectly, I now know. The second mode of representation is ethnographic representation, and that would be associated with natural history museums. If you look at an early image of the Museum of Natural History in New York, I think what's interesting about the ethnographic representation or the natural history representation is that there's no boundary between nature and culture. So this image shows taxidermied deer heads on the wall, along with African objects such as shields and spears and arrows that are all sort of decoratively positioned on the wall and on the columns. If you go to the Natural History Museum today, which I actually was there on Saturday with my class, this is what it looks like. This was installed largely by Colin Turnbull in the 1970s and has not been changed since then. It's called the Hall of African Peoples. And again, it too presents a peculiar image of Africa. The nature is not in the hall now, but you have to walk through African mammals before you get to the hall, so it's not disconnected in that way. And I think what's absent from the natural history installation of African objects is any sense of aesthetics. So these objects are not being treated as aesthetic objects. They're not being treated as treasures that even have an economic value. I would think that would be a conservator's nightmare to put objects on top of a kuba cloth the way they're displayed on the right. Unfortunately, for the purposes of this talk, natural history doesn't have a Dimba on display, but if they did, it would pretty much look like the other masks that are in this. Also looks like an aquarium. That's a good term. Or actually, this looks even more like an aquarium. And I think, the last thing I'll say about the ethnographic representation is not only does it not focus on aesthetics, but it uses quantity in a different way from the colonial representation. So the colonial representation is quantity for the sake of testifying to power and to conquest and to looting. In this case, it's more of a scientific approach to quantity, where if you look at the mass display, which is called Mass and Social Control, it looks a lot like the butterfly display in another part of the Natural History Museum. So it's about identifying types, about identifying species, and that if you show multiples of the same species, you can then reduce those to types and classify them and put them in a typology. The third mode of representation is what I would call the modernist primitivist representation, much of which Yael focused on in her talk. And here, African objects are displayed as aesthetic objects, but they're not displayed as aesthetic objects in their own right. They're there to testify to the genius of European artists for having discovered the aesthetic value of African art. So they're still deeply connected to Europe and to European art, and they're there as a testament to the catalyst for what started the modernist primitivism movement with Picasso and others, but I would not say they're there to testify to the genius of the African artist. So this is the show Yael just showed from 1935. And again, if you contrast it to the colonial mode of exhibition, you can see how, as Yael pointed out, it has been stripped of its costume, and it's also been placed inside the white cube. The primitivist mode of exhibition came to a head and sort of burned out, I think, in 1984 in the very controversial exhibition, which was also at the Museum of Modern Art, curated by William Rubin, Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern. And in that show, two Dimbas were exhibited, and I believe they were both the ones owned by Picasso, but I may be wrong. And they were there again as visual props to make the visual connection between Picasso's bust of a woman from 1931 and the Dimba figures, which clearly influenced them. So what's absent? So what's present here is the African art being used to testify to the genius of the European artist. What's absent is, again, any African cultural context, but also any African, any attention to African creativity or to African artistic production, and certainly any notion that Africa is still producing art today. So Africa in these representations is very much represented as being dead. A point which Jim Clifford made very nicely in his review of the Primitivism show, in which he said nothing on West 53rd Street suggests that good tribal art is being produced in the 1980s. So there is no indigenous voice. The indigenous voice has been silenced. The fourth mode is the art museum representation, which I think on the surface is not necessarily that different immediately from the modernist primitivist, but I think here the effort is being made to disconnect African art to its parallels or to the inspiration for modernist art, and to show it in its own right. And I think, I'm not sure where you would start that history. I think the image that Yael showed of the Nelson Rockefeller installation at the Century Association is an early example of that. I think a more filled out example of that is really the birth of the National Museum of African Art, first on A Street and then in the 1980s on the National Mall, founded by Warren Robbins. I don't have any installation shots from the National Museum of African Art, but if you look at one of their early exhibitions, which was the de Havilland collection in 1971, Gaston de Havilland was a dealer and collector based in New York City. I don't know how they exhibited his Dimba, but I think the photography is certainly interesting in the sense that the photography again shows that very tight shot on the image itself. It's not about context, it's about the image, the surface, and it really looks like the Dimba is sort of floating in space, kind of magically on this. You don't even see the backdrop. Not only is the photography minimalist, and I would assume the installation was probably minimalist, but the text is pretty minimalist too. It has a number. It has the ethnic group. It does call it a shoulder mask, and then gives you one dimension in inches, and then a detail on the right. That sort of art representation is, of course, continued in the Rockefeller wing today, which we've talked a lot about. So I'm going to move on. At the Art Institute of Chicago, the costume has been put back on, but as I now know, it's been put back on incorrectly, which is great to know these things. And then lastly, at the Louvre, an image we've already seen. Here, I think it's less clear from these images, but I think, one of the things I would say the biggest difference from the Louvre and the Met is that there is actually no text at all at the Louvre. And if you want any text, you have to pick up a laminated guide sheet, which is hidden in a corner of the gallery, which I've never seen anyone in my times there actually using it. So it's really, there's a sense in the art museum representation that text and ethnographic context are in fact impediments to appreciating the aesthetic of the work of art. So it's been stripped of its aesthetic qualities, of its ethnographic qualities in order to highlight its aesthetic qualities. And I think you see the contrast pretty clearly on both sides of Central Park here, with the Met on the right and the Museum of Natural History on the left. Similar types of objects, but being exhibited in radically different ways and communicating radically different messages in so doing. The Louvre also is not only trying to elevate African art to the level of aesthetic object, but it is actually making even bolder claims that it is creating equality within French society. The curator, Maurice Godelier, an anthropologist, says by this gesture, inclusion in the Louvre, all of humanity's masterworks, and with them the societies that created them, become equal. Their presence in the same space demonstrated once and for all that there is no progress in art and that no society has a monopoly on human creation. It's a lofty statement. I'm not sure the Louvre actually transformed France that radically into an egalitarian society, but that apparently was the goal. I just want to raise a couple of other points besides these modes of representation, and I'll be curious what Fred has to say about this one, since this is his former institution. But I read a quote a couple years ago by the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, which I thought was really interesting, perplexing, and raises some questions about this idea of universal aesthetics. Because I think one of the things you could argue about the art museum representation is that it is making claims that art has a universal appeal, that there are aesthetics that are universally understood, and that you don't need ethnographic context to understand them, that anyone can grasp this art without understanding the cultures necessarily from which they came. And Doreen Bolger, the director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, said the following: "Visitors entering our contemporary wing may have just viewed an 18th century American period room, a Flemish old master painting, or an African Baga mask in another part of the museum. The obvious craftsmanship, skill, and historical or cultural significance of these works make them seem more familiar. But what's to be made of Carl André's zinc magnesium plane installed on the gallery's floor, or Bruce Naumann's blinking neon work, Raw War?" So I guess my question is, it's sort of surprising to me that a Baga mask requires no interpretation to understand it. At least that's the logic of that statement, whereas contemporary art by Carl André requires art historical training or some sort of context to understand it. I would argue that both require some context to understand it, as in Bruce Naumann's piece, which I think will... No, never mind. There was a little video that made it switch between Raw and War, but we'll skip that. The points I've been making so far are really points that are not that new. These ideas go back certainly to the 1980s. A lot of them came out in reaction to the Primitivism show in 1984, and the exhibition curated by Susan Vogel at the Center for African Art in 1989, Art Artifact, really laid this argument down that the transformative power of the museum can change something from an object into a work of art, or the word artification, which I didn't know until today either. And the example she gave was this hunting net from the Congo, which had been in the collection of the Museum of Natural History, but when you install it on a low platform, you light it with brilliant light, it becomes a contemporary work of art, or it can be read as a contemporary work of art. And of course, the other example she gives is Alan Capro's Yard, which is, when it's at a New York gallery, it becomes a work of art. When tires are in a junkyard, they're just tires. So it speaks, I think, to the power of the museum to transform anything into art based on the framework of the museum. I'm going to skip that slide. And I'm just going to end with talking about the art market, because I think one of the other absences besides ethnographic context that many museums don't engage with is the art market and how these objects actually came to be in collections, who the collectors were, what kind of transactions had to take place for the objects to end up in a museum. And I think the Baga, the Dimba, is a perfect example, and it really presents the perfect storm for the art market, because it has three really powerful things that the art market can capitalize on. The first is the ethnographic context of disappearance. The fact that in the 1950s, the tradition was squashed by Sékou Touré, the masks ceased to be made, although they were revived, really puts a finite point on its production, so it creates a limited edition, which is a wonderful thing for the art market. And if you look at auction catalogs, in their description of Dimba masks, they of course highlight those points to increase the economic value. So this is Sotheby's Dimba that was sold in 2007 from the Lindner collection. And in the catalog it says, Nimba masks disappeared in the 1950s after the government of Sékou Touré ancestral ceremonies and destroyed the instruments dedicated to this cult. And then in the provenance, it says collected by a colonial administrator before 1950. So the provenance underscores the rarity as it's been set up. The second point is connections to Picasso and the great masters of modernism, modernist primitivism. So again, I think connections to modern art are inevitably heightened the economic value of something. And again, if you look at Sotheby's, this is from the 2014 catalog of the sale of a Dimba. In the catalog, for no apparent reason, it juxtaposes it to this line drawing by Picasso with no other commentary, it's just there. And then if you look at the New York auction in 2014 of the Mackler family's Dimba, it randomly connects it to a line drawing by Giacometti, again with no context, just to make the point of heightening its economic value. And then finally, I think the Dimba has an interesting, what I would call the visual power of aesthetic force and the fetishism of difference, that it is such a unique and powerful looking object that collectors have described the Dimba as actually calling to them to purchase the object, calling to them, luring them into, seducing them into buying her. And again, looking at the last of the Sotheby's catalogs, this is the Murray Frum collection in 2015, the sale of that Dimba. It says in the catalog, this is a quote from Murray Frum, beware of anything that seems pretty. If it's immediately accessible to you, that means it was probably made for you or somebody like you. The measure of good tribal art is its force, not its decorative appeal. So again, this idea that the object, the object as fetish, to return to that, how it was described in the early 20th century, really is a fetish that is attracting the collector. And in his discussion of how he actually acquired the Dimba mask, Murray Frum talks about going into Alain de Montbrisson's gallery in Paris. And again, in the catalog, he says, Nancy and I happened to be in Paris on the day Alain brought the Baga to his gallery, intending to keep it in the basement out of sight until he could decide how much to ask for it. But I saw it, I was relentless and prevailed upon him to let me buy it. And I really like that quote because it speaks to the power of the object to seduce the collector, but it also is interesting that so much African art is shrouded in secrecy in its original context, and here you have the object shrouded in secrecy in the gallery and becomes even more powerful when its secret is out. African Dimbas are not limited to Sotheby's. They also show up on eBay in great quantities. This is actually one of the more expensive ones, listing at $2,500. And I thought what was particularly interesting is in the description, it says, and I won't read the whole thing, but it says this piece was was brought into the U.S. In the 1960s by an avid collector of African artifacts. This is not recently made, less valuable tourist art that a lot of other eBay sellers are advertising. So there you go. In a review of the Tishman collection at the Tishman Disney collection at the National Museum of African Art, Holland Cotter, the art critic for the New York Times, wrote in 2007, collectors are represented as benign heroes and art magically appears in their hands from nowhere, or rather from a vague somewhere called Africa. And I think what I would just end with is, in terms of the exhibition of the Dimba at the Davis Museum, I think in addition to thinking about ethnographic context and in addition to thinking about costume, also thinking about the invisible pathways by which the object got here and the market systems that allowed it to enter into the art market to begin with. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much. I really appreciate that you're prepared from these various perspectives. I think gave us a very well-rounded approach to the Dimba as a genre and how we've come to know it over the last century. And I thought I would open up by asking quite directly your thoughts and suggestions, other than Givenchy, for future display of the Dimba here at the Davis, whether temporary or for a permanent gallery. Yeah, you look like you have something ready.
Not really, but okay. I think what's important is always to think of I think each museum has its own identity, has its own reason for displaying. African art has its own history. And so that's where I think that a university museum, has a very different mission and a very different way of thinking about displaying art than a place like the Met. And I don't know, I'm wondering if, to what extent you would be able to change its display on a regular basis to some extent to say, a different side of the story. And I think to some extent, the three different points that Chris pointed out at the end, the history of the disappearance, the modernist perspective, and then kind of this hypnotism effect, that African object might have had on collectors. Are almost, three ways of looking and displaying these and asking questions about its history, its collecting history, and its how we're seeing it in the West. And,
Well, I really like the way it's displayed, and I'm glad you're not going to put Givenchy on it. But I've always, since I've been a curator my entire life, I've always been confronted with the limitations of what a museum can do, and you can't recreate the original context. You shouldn't recreate the original context. This is not a Baga village. This is a gallery in a museum. And you could buy up the entire village. In fact, this was done at a World's Fair one time, and buy up the whole village, the old people and everything, and have them sit there and you can watch them and tell them to go do their thing and dance and all of that. Well, that would be ridiculous. So, and not to mention insulting. And no one would learn anything because you're not there. You're in an art gallery. So it would be really distorted. So you have to think about what can you do in the art gallery that makes sense within that context. And so I like the way that you have positioned it. I've always, one of the main points I've always tried to follow in my installations is at least to show it to the extent that you can in the position that they would have seen it in the original context. So at least position it at the height that they would have seen it. And this makes a huge difference, and you have done this. It's perfect. I said when we went over there, it's exactly at the level of a head of a man who would be wearing this. And that's how they would see it. They would be looking up at it. And I have a story about this when I was at the Baltimore Museum of Art, how much this makes a really important difference, because I showed their Dumba at Baltimore, and I had it photographed one time, and the photographer sent back the pictures, and I kept saying, do it over, it doesn't look quite right, there's something wrong about it, I can't quite figure it out. It doesn't capture the majesty of this mask. And then I finally realized he's shooting it from straight ahead or even down. And I thought, that's not the way they see it. So I said, shoot it from below. And it made an enormous difference just in the photograph. Now it had the majesty that it's supposed to have. So that's important. And I like the way you've turned it. It's not on a 90-degree angle. And this is the other thing that I've always despised, 90-degree angles. Let's get rid of them. They don't have them in Africa, in my experience. They have rounded forms, and they have things a little bit, like a 94-degree angle. Or let's get rid of that rigidity. So I like the way it's positioned right at you when you come in. It's turned on the pedestal. I wouldn't necessarily dress it, although it's something you could do, maybe in a special exhibition. Or, because first of all, you don't have the room to do it. You need a lot of room for people to go around it. And you don't have to. I didn't at Yale. I showed it with the photographs, and you have photographs of the object in situ. So that's very important. And you have color in the galleries. And so I think when you display African art, you think about how much of the original context could I simply suggest in the way that I display it. Not try to do it literally, because you're not in an African village. You're in a gallery here at Wellesley College. So all of this is always important to recognize.
I would just building off of what my colleague said. I think Fred is obviously right that you can't recreate ethnographic context in a Western museum. I think an attempt to do so, or to give you an idea, an impression of what it might look like, is correct. But I think that what a lot of museums, the opportunity they've missed, is to also talk about, to sort of emphasize the artificiality of the object in the museum context itself, which we sort of take great pains to deny that in the museum context. So I think actually heightening that, as well as the ethnographic context, putting both side by side, would be an interesting way to present it. And what struck me in both presentations before me is the power of photography to do that. So maybe you could even commission photographs of the Dimba, in different contexts, in the stark black and white context where it's floating in space, with the costume on from different angles. I think there was a show at the museum, the Center for African Art, years ago called Close Up, African Art and Photography, that looked at the power of photography to change the way we view objects. And that might be a way to bring different contexts in without, dressing her and undressing her every week.
I'm actually going to go ahead and open it up to the audience to make sure that we have plenty of time for your participation. Yes, Lou.
Does the same kind of discussion or controversy exist with respect to other objects that had an original purpose beyond being shown as a piece of art? In other words, porcelain or icons, and what can, that kind of controversy does exist, what can one learn from that controversy for other objects that are out of context once they're in a museum?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting comment, and we dealt with this a little bit at Yale because we have medieval art, And that was just as much as African. That was in context. That was used in context. It was used in religious context for the most part. And so what do you do with that? Would you create a whole altarpiece with the pieces that you have and show the other and put pieces together and recreate an altarpiece? And and you know, I think that would be very interesting. People would see how it was used. You can't always, everyone can't go to Europe and visit the great cathedrals. And, you know, I once said, I was talking about an exhibition that I was going to do on the Dumbo, which never happened, but, you know, how could we recreate that experience for people within a museum? And somebody said, well, you know, instead of recreating that, why don't you just give everybody tickets to go to Guinea and see the dance in a village? Be done with it. Do it right. So anyway, you know, there are problems with that, with the, for example, the medieval context too. What, you know, in terms of the African context, I've often said, well, if you did send them to Guinea and watch a performance, would they really understand what they're looking at? And the same with the medieval. If you could send them back to a cathedral in France, or you somehow time travel back to, you know, the 14th century, would they understand what they're looking at all? Would they understand the context? Would they even understand what the people were saying? So this is, you know, a very significant problem in museum presentation. Also, you might have some people who would say, what right does a museum have to recreate a cathedral setting within the museum where you might not even be Christian? And so, you know, that's another thing. In the African context, what right would we really have to recreate that ceremony when we don't even believe in their gods? So, so in any case, that's a problem. There was an exhibition done by the Fowler Museum at the UCLA one time on Haitian Vodou. And I thought it was really effectively done, and they involved Haitians themselves, practitioners of Vodou in Haiti, also in New York City, and they actually had Haitian Vodou practitioners create a temple. And you could go in there and you could sit down, and it showed all the paintings that they have on the walls, and it showed the music. And we took that exhibition at Baltimore, and I thought it was very effectively done. Very difficult to do what they did, but I think they did it really effectively, involving the original artists from Vodou. And it became, these artists considered those installations to be a real temple. And when we showed it in Baltimore, we invited the Vodou community to come and see it. There are Vodou practitioners in Washington a lot, and Baltimore and Philadelphia. And they used the shrines. And so it became an issue. The conservators were concerned, okay, well, people are throwing money into the displays, and one of the things you offer the Vodou gods is cigarettes. So people were throwing in cigarettes and whole packs of cigarettes and so forth. So we're, okay, you know, everything in there, the registers have to register, you know, we have to give a number, a loan number. And then now what do we do with this stuff when it's in there? Should we, you know, register it in and paint numbers on it and so forth? Or does it belong to us? Or should we give it back to the Vodou community? And they decided eventually to do that these things really belong to the Vodou practitioners, and they gave it to a Vodou temple, these offerings that were made. So.
Chris, do you have a response to that to think about how the discourses around the social lives of African objects compare to the discourses around the social lives of any other kinds of objects?
Yeah, it's a good, and actually, I was going to do the Fowler Haitian example as well. So the great minds. The other response I would have to Lou's question is, twofold. One, I think African and other so-called tribal arts entered the museum scene much later than medieval altars and Renaissance altars. So maybe that transition into the museum, is now complete for the European art. It's still happening for the non-Western art. Is one response. And the other response is, and this struck me on Saturday when I took my class to the Natural History Museum as we're walking through African mammals to get to the African people, and then we walked out through the Asian people halls with huge displays on Buddhism, huge displays on temple implements and shrine implements from Asia, many of which are probably similar to what's at the Met. And what struck me is that the discourse on museum representations of non-Western art has really been dominated by African art, and I think a lot of that is because of the literature that came out after 1984 and the Primitivism show and the people who were involved in that, like Susan Vogel and James Clifford. But I think maybe there is a comparable literature on Asian art and how that is represented in these different modes, but I'm not aware of it. So I think we focus so much on Africa because that's where the literature has been, but I think one could expand that into Asian for sure and come up with similar questions and similar issues, which we're talking about today.
I'm not sure how much I could add, but it's true that we have period rooms at the Met, which recreate interiors of American houses. So you could ask why not do period rooms of sorts for Africa. But I think it just raises question about representation of in the West, representation of the other, and how a Western museum is going to position itself in representing culture that is just removed from its own. And then I think a lot of museums are just struggling and trying to find the right way of approaching this in a respectful way that does take in consideration the original significance of the work and its original context, and also showing them in an equal footing to the other works that are presented within the museum as great works of art. And so I think we are in this tension that constantly, that's not something that will be resolved easily. Cynthia, yeah?
So thank you very much for your presentations. I thought it was really fascinating. This is really nicely organized, and it's great to hear 3 different points of view. But I wonder if you could throw gender into the mix as well, because it seems to me when I visit exhibitions on African art, there's an emphasis on the male carver or the male dancer, but there's women who are singing, as Fred talked about in his presentation, or the figure is actually laying down in front of a woman who just gave birth. So womanhood is really central. So do you think that could be emphasized somehow, and how could you do it? Or is that really not necessary? Because it is really men carving. So.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And for a long time, most of the research on Africa was done by men. That's not true anymore. But, in the case of Dumba, yes, it's a male, it's a man dancing it. It's a man who carves it, and that's generally true in Africa. It's the men who carve these objects, sacred objects. But definitely it matters who is asking the questions. And I had a really interesting experience. I tend to interview old men. Now, even when I was a young man, I interviewed old men because they have the historical knowledge. And besides, the women who are very busy, as you know, in Africa, it's the women who are doing all the work. And they're very busy. They don't have a whole lot of time to sit down and talk with you. And then there is this problem of a man talking with a woman there. There is a little bit of a problem with that. But I had an interesting experience. I went in 2008. I went back and I took a group of scholars with me, a team, and there were 3 women and 3 men, and we all went back to look at the Dumba. And we were going to do a big exhibition on this, but our project was to go back. All of us, it grew out of my book, See the Music, Hear the Dance, where I said that we need to have different perspectives looking at the same thing, and we need to look at it in terms of performance, in terms of dance, in terms of the music. And this is what art historians don't do. We just look at that physical object. So I put my money where my mouth was, or I put the NEA and NEH money where my mouth was, and took this team. So we had a woman who's a dancer, we had a man who's a musician, a woman who deals in aesthetics, a woman who deals with cinematography and so forth, a scientist. And we all looked at the same performance. And the dancer, the woman, said one time, because Dumba has these long, flat breasts, and so she said, why don't I go around and ask everybody what kind of breasts they like? Do they like flat breasts, or do they like firm, round breasts? And that was something that I never would have even thought to ask people, and even if the thought had entered my head, I probably would have been embarrassed to go around and ask. And besides, I thought I already knew the answer. Of course, I mean, we have our idea of, that comes from Vogue magazine and Playboy and so forth. So she went around and did this. And of course, she could do it better than I could. As a woman, she could pull this off a little bit better than I would have been able to. And the response was shocking. Everyone, both men and women, young and old, said that flat breasts are more attractive. And that's what Dumba has, and she's considered the symbol of beauty among the Baga. And the reason she figured out is that when they're considering beauty and Dumba as a symbol of beauty, they're considering not just the flesh, they're considering the character of that woman, what she represents. She's an honorable woman, she is devoted to her family and so forth. And they said that that was more beautiful. So that was a great eye-opener to me about what the Baga value. And of course, I never would have asked the question, and I never would have gotten the answer.
Time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Can I make one quick comment? I was just going to make another comment on gender in a slightly different tone. And that one of the slides I skipped over because I was afraid of running out of time was 2 pictures from women collectors. And I think, that the whole rise of African art, or the Dimba in particular, to modernism is a very masculine story, and the triumph of Picasso and associated with masculinity. And the 2 female collectors that I had photographs of, one was the Catherine White collection from Seattle in 1979, which is the only private collection I could find in which in her house the Dimba had the raffia skirt and the cloth. And I read that image as a very domestic scene, and maybe read kind of female gender into the way it was displayed. And the other was Peggy Guggenheim's Demba in Venice, and there are 3 photographs of her, and in all 3, she is physically touching the object, sort of touching its head, touching its shoulders. And again, I don't know any photographs of male collectors kind of hugging the Dimba in that way. So it struck me as a very female gesture.
Yes, I was going to ask for a student question. I want a hand shot up. Yes.
Hi, I'm training to be a student guide here, and one of the things we work on is how to help visitors to the museum develop visual thinking skills. And with the Dimba, because it's the female body is the subject, and because it's about the accentuation of female characteristics, about scarification, and some of the other pieces in the gallery include scarification or accentuation of jewelry. When we're developing visual thinking skills, I'm worried about balancing an interest in critical thinking and critical looking with aestheticization or objectification of women in that gallery. How do you balance those sort of conflicting outcomes or consequences?
Okay. So it's true that it's something, giving tours on a regular basis at the Met, in the galleries, and it's always something that I'm very conscious of in the way that I describe works in the gallery. And there is actually a whole vocabulary that I'm very careful to use or not to use. And I mean, interestingly, and maybe colleagues will not agree with this, but we actually don't use the word scarification at the Met in the African galleries, just because and we would rather use cicatrice or beauty marks or, just a term that expresses more the significance that it might have had for the people who did it, rather than this idea of scarification that is somewhat very loaded for a Western audience. So there is definitely, a lot of thinking that goes in the choices of words and the different elements that I would emphasize when looking at a work. I think for the example of Dimba, it is about women, so I think that emphasizing the breast and the femininity of it and in the dance and all this, I think is central to how you should talk about that work. Yes, if that answers the question. But it's true, at the same time being conscious of maybe what the general public is going to think, as you're telling your story, and then you can adjust a little bit the thinking.
And we can talk about this more later as well, obviously. But I think for the Demba and other works, one thing I know we've talked about in our previous session is that she represents this ideal human both physically and in character. Right, and so when we've talked about her, we talk about like this representation of ideal beauty and look very closely like at those characteristics, right? But that also have various symbolic and metaphoric meanings as well. Like she is an older woman who has nursed many children and has these beautiful flat breasts, but also we are to presume is this a successful farmer and business person. Like there are all of these social characteristics that we see in this idealization as well. You've had your hand up several times.
This is a very short question. Motion. First thing you said was Baga people don't see Dumba not in motion. So what would it mean to show motion, either in photographs of movement or video shot by Baga themselves on cell phones and beamed in? I mean, I just think there's a lot of possibility, and I think that would really add a lot of useful information for audience. I wonder what you think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, she is to be seen in motion, and that's true of most of African art. And I made a point of that in my book on See the Music, Hear the Dance, with the Banda mask, that it struck me when I was watching the Banda mask in situ, and that was a real ceremony in Guinea, that I was there, and it was dancing for maybe 2 or 3 hours, and I was behind the camera all the time trying to, I did all my own stuff. A video camera and another camera hanging off here and a tape recorder hanging off here and trying to do it all. And I realized that I could not figure out what this mask looked like until I got home. In those days, you didn't see your pictures until you got home. You didn't have digital. So you sent everything home to be developed. And then you got home and you sit in your living room and you watch and you see, oh, that's what I saw. So then when I analyzed in the video, then I could figure out what the Banda mask had, that it had a crocodile jaw and it had I think a chameleon on top or something, and the horns and so forth. It had all the things that a Banda mask is supposed to have. But I could not see it when I was there watching it. And it struck me that you're not supposed to necessarily see all these little details. You're supposed to, when the carver carved that mask, he was thinking how that would be when it was being twirled around and danced and movement, constant movement, very vigorous movement. You're supposed to get a completely different image of it. It's a very abstract image that you're seeing. And you don't walk up to it on a pedestal and analyze all these little different forms. They're meant to be seen as sort of as a blur and this constant movement. So, but to do that in a gallery is problematic, of course. Yes, you could put it on a turntable and have it, spun around. A little problematic in an art gallery. And one thing that I thought was very effective that showed this, Robert Farris Thompson, who you reviewed one time and was my professor at Yale. We all know the limitations and the power of that man as well. But he did an exhibition called African Art in Motion, and to be honest, that was in 1974, and that's what really propelled me. That's what got me excited about African art, and actually convinced me to go to Yale to work with this man because of that exhibition, African Art in Motion, and it was at the National Gallery. And he showed a Yoruba costume of it's called gelede, and it's made of strips of cloth. It's a huge costume, and all strips of cloth. And they mounted it using probably wire and all kinds of things with all the strips of cloth flying out. And it was very effective. It wasn't moving. They didn't have it on a spinner. But you could really get an idea of the effect of what that would look like in real dance. And then behind it, he had a video of an actual performance of the gelede with it just flying out, strips of cloth. And so I thought that was a very, very effective way of showing it within the limitations of an art gallery.
One thing in the videos that you made of Dumba, I thought it was, seeing it almost completely leaning back is really not the way we're usually displaying it, which are representing it in photograph, which is always this front and profile. It's this just like the real, this very strong angle is probably something to keep in mind. The issue of videos in galleries, and that's also, it depends from one museum to the other, and what the mission of a particular institution is, and the vision and the aesthetics that one wants to achieve. But you were talking earlier about, this idea that ethnographic information, that a lot of museums think that the inclusion of ethnographic information lead you away from the aesthetic. And it's, I think we want to include ethnographic information. We are happy to include photographs. It's true that having videos really draws the attention away from the object itself. And maybe, there are ways of having monitors in other areas of the galleries and having films and being able, there are certainly ways of doing it, but it's true, at least in a place like the Met, I don't think that I would want to have videos next to the work, because I would have the feeling that, it has to be about these works seen as works of art. And if you include a lot of videos, then also it gets a bit distracting within an art setting. But, I think it totally depends of the institution itself and what the overall mission is.
I was just going to make 2 points in response to the question. One, first, I think the most effective videos in galleries are where it's the actual object that's on display that's in the video. Yeah. So I think that's an authentic connection that's being made. The other point, I was just going to sort of underscore the last point I was trying to make in my talk, and to also acknowledge the importance of African Art in Motion, Robert Farris Thompson's book, An Exhibition, which I think is a monumental book. And my first book, African Art in Transit, was purposely titled that way as an homage to African Art in Motion, playing with the idea of transit, and that's the other part I was trying to say is missing from the exhibition. It's not only the kinetic context, but it's also the market history and the art market context that's missing. So if we can bring African Art in Motion and African Art in Transit together in the gallery, then we're onto something.
Right, and we'll wrap up so we have time for a reception, but I'll add that screens are not only possible in the gallery, but we have an app, in fact, and I do hope to develop a tour on our app focusing on African masquerades. So you would actually be able to access the video on your own phone. So it's a different, like it interacts with the object in a different way, and it's actually available outside of the museum as well. So it's not something we have now, but something that we're considering. So I want to thank our guests again. Invite everyone to the lobby of the Davis for a reception, and for those of you who have not been into the gallery, I will be happy to lead you so that you can see the Dimba in person, as well as the rest of our reinstalled permanent galleries. We'll see you over there.